Hello everyone, my name is Mike Bonifacio. I work for Home Depot Tech. Some people, they think about Home Depot, they don't really think about the tech side of things, but we are very much into Angular and we have a lot of tech that drives the business. And so when we deal with the business and we deal with Angular, there's a lot of things that we learned over the years. And especially when it comes to applications that we built. I don't know how many of you build forms in Angular, but I think a lot of us do. And so this particular subject matter we're talking about is about forms. And the problem is with a lot of times with forms that we have to deal with is maintaining them, or when a new developer comes on board, they have to learn certain components and figure out how that works. So what we kind of done is we've kind of minimize the amount of work that necessary for onboarding of a developer to be able to understand how to build Angular apps. And one of the key things that we're going to talk about today is Angular components as value accessors. I don't know how many have converted Angular components into value accessors, but this is what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about some details about it. So one key thing I think about is, I think about Doctor Who and the TARDIS. And the TARDIS is a time machine, basically. And there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, there's something that has to come from the outside world that goes into the TARDIS. And then, of course, there's information that comes out of the TARDIS so that people understand what's happening. And some of the key things that we're going to talk about is how to access these two things so that we don't have to write a lot of code to do it. And so we're going to take a look at what value accessors are, how we create custom value accessors, the benefits, and some examples. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the TARDIS is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. So value accessors are very much the same. There's a lot that goes on in them, but when we use them, there's not much there. So we're going to take a look and see how that works. Okay. So first of all, what is a value accessor? Well, if you've ever seen the model, a value accessor connects the controls of components data model, right? That's the first thing. It defines how components interact with form controls. So we've seen this a lot of times. We make a new control, and then we know that that particular information that we patch data into gets passed into that value accessor. Then it provides this bridge that basically allows us to now communicate with the actual control. So this is your component. And then, of course, your component's going to do something. The user interacts with it, and then it responds, and it gives it back to the value accessor, and then the synchronization of the data structure happens. So this is how Angular control value accessors work. Now, do we use value accessors? Well, if you're used to material components, yes, material components, all of them are value accessors. If you didn't know that, well, you can take a look at the page once again, but you'll notice that all of those components have form control ability. Now, one example that you see here is the chip. So the material chip's pretty easy to use, nothing complicated, but basically this value accessor connects the controls to the data model, right? So we have some kind of data model, and then the form control responds. Then we define how it's going to interact. So if we want to click on the chips, then basically it'll select the chips. And then, of course, once we select the chips, if we got what we want, then we can send it back, right? And so that bridge goes back to the form group or form control that it originally came from. And of course, our data gets synchronized, right? All seamlessly. We don't have to think about it. Now, let's have a look at this. So we're going to take a look at some code and see how that actually looks like. So we're going to look at, this is going to be a little bit awkward because I'm going to switch back and forth to the screen because I can't share my desktop. But here we're going to talk about first what we're looking at. Okay, so this is chips. Basically, if I load up this particular, make sure I got the right one. Yes. Okay, good. So we have the chips. We have the chips that are set out there. This is a standard form control. If I basically select, there's an event that basically will fire, and then of course that will select the chip. And then of course I have a couple of other buttons that basically will submit the chip information, so I can see in the console log, it gives us the feedback. If I reset it, it will reset the chips, and then if I disable it, it will disable the chipset and enable. So all these things are kind of free, right? You played around with form controls and reactive forms, and you can see how powerful they are because they really allow you to do a lot of things without writing a lot of code. So let's take a look at what the code looks like. All right, so here's the HTML. So the part we're going to look at is just basically this section here. So here is the chip that we have. Basically, it's just an NG4 that goes around, and here's our chip, and basically displays it. And then if we select the chip, then basically it's going to go. What's that? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So let's see if we can change the contrast here. Settings, let's do. Is that better? Okay, maybe I'll make it a little larger. Yeah, is that better? Okay, that's better. Okay, that's good. Sorry about that. I didn't even notice that. Okay, so what we have is just the chip control. So here's the chips. We basically have an array of strings that basically gets iterated, and then of course we have the ability to select an event that we select on it, and then the chip just basically patches itself to control. The control is defined here. So here we are, form control, chips. And when we go to the TS file, we can definitely see here's our chips that we're drawing. Then basically we have the selected state where we basically patch the selected item, and that's it. If we want to disable it, we just have an event here that basically says, okay, I want you to disable it. And if it's not disabled, then enable it. So very straightforward. You submit this value, right? And if you wanted to, you can keep the observable pattern and use value changes, and then you could observe what's coming in. So what's beautiful about form controls is that they are observable and they give you a lot of flexibility. So then how do we go about doing this? So if you have a component, try to put form control and then the control that you created, right? You do that, Angular's going to yell at you. So the reason why it says no value accessor for form control. Obviously, your component is not a value accessor. So how do you convert a component into a value accessor? Well, it's actually not much work. So the first thing you do is you go to your component and you basically provide the value accessor there. So you do that in the providers area. And then the last thing you'll see there is that the component needs to be specified so it knows where to forward those events. The next thing is you basically have a value accessor that's part of your implementation. So when you do this, then Angular is going to yell at you and say, now you have to incorporate these functions. So these functions are pretty straightforward. One is optional, right? So the first one that we look at is the right value. Right? So right value, all it is basically when you patch a control or a form, basically that value or that object, that data, that structure, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is, it will be passed into this function. You can do whatever you want in this function with that object. You can rip it apart and then provide it to your component the way you want. The next part is where we register the controls. So in order for this to happen, we need to create functions. We usually do this above the constructor, so keep it nice and neat. And then we basically now have those functions available to us in these two functions that we have with these methods.
I'm not sure the screen projector is synchronizing. That's just the column.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait a second. You know what? I didn't switch back to the thing here. There we go. Okay, so let me go back here. That's it. So I'll just start from the top here. Okay, sorry about that. You see that? Yeah, okay. So this is your component, right? And like I said, if you put it form control, then basically Angular is going to give you this error message. Once it gives you this error message, you know that you got to implement the value accessor. So the first thing you do is you basically go to your provider where your component is and you provide it. And you'll see here, this is what we provide. Now it needs a forwarding type. So we take the component that you have and we use that as the forwarding type. Now once we've done that, then we just simply add the control value accessor implementation. When we do that, Angular is going to yell at you and say you must incorporate these methods, right? So what are these methods? Well, the first one here is the right value. This is where I was saying any data that gets patched through the control gets put into here. So that means you, the recipient of right value, can now rip apart that data structure. The next part is register on change, register untouched. These events need to be forwarded so that we can actually use this and make sure the control is valid or not valid if it's been touched, or if a value needs to be passed. So that's what we use those two functions over there for. We put those in the constructor, and then basically we create the two methods here that we see on the right or on the left. The last thing is optional. This is the disabled state. So if you want to implement disabled, well, this will be passed in, true or false, and then you basically do whatever you want with your component. And that's it. Now, you can go ahead and create a special method if you want called setValue, and you can call this on change. When you call this on change, you pass the value, and this value that gets passed gets sent back to the parent control automatically. So that's what that happens. The right value, like we said, is the patch. So as soon as you patch something, the value comes in. This change is the one that sends the data back out. And then of course the other two just listen for these particular changes. And that's it. No input, no output, no event emitters, no nothing. So overall, the value accessors provide a nice way to make custom components more iterable or interpretable with Angular's built-in Forms API. And that's what you want, because mostly all Angular developers understand how the Form APIs work. They allow you to create real usable components that can interact with form controls just like other built-in form controls. They provide more consistent way to implement for developers, and even validation can be part of your component. So what a way to do that, right? And then of course, forms are observables, they're reactive. So you don't have to do anything special, right? No behavior subject, no making it as observable, nothing. It's live. So let's try to convert a particular component into a value accessor. Let's see what's involved. So first of all, we're going to look at okay, so we're going to look at this component. There it goes, a little delay. So now this is just a regular checkbox list, right? So this is copy and paste code from Angular material. So if you don't know how to do that, just go there and do it. Now what we have here is just 3 checkboxes. So I have a data model that basically says it's disabled, what's the label name, is it selected or not, right? Very simple data model. And what I want to do is when I check one of these, I want to actually check to see whether or not the minimum requirement is been provided and the maximum is not provided, right? So if it's past maximum, we kind of want to have an error. So it gets pretty complicated when you start thinking about what the component needs to do, right? So in this case, this warm section here is disabled, and these ones allow me to click. And we can see here, every time the events get fired, basically I see the response here. And if I don't get the minimum, I have an error that gets caught. So what does this code look like? Let's have a look. So now, this is our checkbox. So again, it's just a for loop that basically goes through and provides the name of it, says if it's disabled, the color, if it's selected, I have an ng model that reacts to the change and basically updates anything. Okay. So now what do I have? I have an output event emitter that deals with the selected item. Then I have an error emitter that basically tells me if I want the errors, then I can catch them as well. Then I have a couple of maximum inputs that come in so that I know what the requirement is for the component. And then of course I have an adapter that basically adapts this model to the structure that I need for this component, right? If you're not familiar with an adapter, please ask me about it. It's definitely gold. Now, once you have that, I basically deal with selecting the event, passing it back through the event emitter, and so forth. So it gets pretty complicated, right? And this is very simple. It doesn't do much, this component. So now, when we take a look at that, we say, okay, if that's just a simple component, then what does it look like if we were to create a value accessor out of it? Okay, so we're going to take the same thing that looks like that, and we're going to basically make it look like this. Oh, I should show. Yeah, you can see my code. I forget what window I'm in here. Okay, there it is. There we go. Okay, so in this case, let's take a look at what it actually looks like first. Okay, so basically it looks the same as the other one, no difference here. There is a minimum, there is a maximum, but you'll see here I have the errors that are coming in, and I'm just using the Angular material errors, right? And if it reaches past maximum, then basically it disables anything past that. Now I have the ability to submit, so basically it just takes the value out of this control. I can disable the entire checkbox, and I can also patch it with a new set of objects. And then of course I can do the same thing, and on with life, right? So the value accessor now is basically handling a lot of the stuff I don't need to deal with. So I don't have to do that much implementation. And if we take a look at the code, we'll see what that looks like. So in this case, now we have a control, and we basically feed in minimum and maximum, and whether or not we want to disable if the minimum requirement is matched, right? We have the two errors that come up in case we are listening. And what's nice is this is the Angular control that's basically listening for has error, right? And then basically these are the events, whether the actual function or the component is valid, that's nice to know. Whether or not we want to disable it, right? Or enable it, and of course, patch it with something else. And when we look at the code, there's not much there. To disable and enable is just basically taking whatever controls that we want and passing that. We even have a reset that allows us to take the control and reset the whole thing, right? And then there's our data model. So very simple, nothing too complicated, but what's the advantage here? Well, let's take a look at our slide for a second. Okay, so what we understand about value accessors is that you can create custom controls out of components that you have, right? And what's nice about it is you're using Angular's API, so there's no work there. This means you can create reusable components that easily work throughout your application, and they're pretty standard, right? The data binding, well, it's two ways, right? It's observable, so it keeps up to date with other form controls. So if you have a form control within a form control within a form control, then you know that they all respond to one another and react, right? So there's no effort for you to be able to manage those states. And it helps keep the data's component in sync, right? We have validation. So this allows us to put validators inside the component so we can determine what's valid, what's not valid, and we can enforce business rules in there as well. This makes it very modular, so we can separate our controls or our components from the business logic, and we can put all that business logic in the component and control logic in there. And then that way it just behaves how it's supposed to behave as a control value accessor. Overall, they are very powerful, flexible way to interact with Angular's APIs. and they can create forms and controls that work seamlessly between each other in your application. So let's take a look at a real life example and see how complicated can it be. Because at this point, you might say, well, you know, a value accessor, yes, that's a form, there's nothing special with that. Okay, great. But let's take a small example, and if we start expanding that small example, we can see how complicated things can get. So let's take a look at this one here. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's our non-reactive form. Is it working? Doesn't look like it. There it is. Okay, finally came up. Okay, so what we see here is we have one form. So if we want to think about this, sometimes forms can get very complicated. There are certain special things that we want to do. So in this case, the special thing is that checkbox. So imagine if we created something more complicated, such like a bank entry thing that we basically have to enter in a number for a bank account and choose from a list of different banks, and that whole form becomes valid, but it's part of this form. So if we look at the checkbox, think of it like that. So it's a complicated component, it's doing something that the user interacts with. Then we have regular standard inputs, right? So you fill in your name here, your address, and that's it. So now the next thing you gotta do is you gotta validate this form. So how are you gonna do that? Well, first thing, if this is a component on the bottom half, well, you're gonna have to have event emitters that catch the event. Then you gotta sort of say, well, is this valid or not valid? I have to check to see if this is not or not. Okay, that's fine. So you can do that for that component, but now you got the form control at the top. So now you got a form group, and you gotta do the same thing. It has the form group, and then of course it's got its own validation. So now you gotta check that one and the component to be able to figure out whether or not I should turn on the submit button. And you can imagine, the bigger the form gets, the more complicated this becomes. But if you were to convert all this into form controls, then you have no issues. It's actually magic, right? It's just a form group with a bunch of controls. Doesn't matter how complicated the form control or component is, it does exactly what the other ones do. So let's take a look at what it looks like. Okay, so from a form list, we're going to take a look at the reactive version. Reactive form. Okay, so what we have here in the reactive form, like I said, we have a form group. Here's the name, which is just an input, and we have a control for it, name. This is address. And now if we take a look at the one that we just built, the list, it's also a control, and it's a control name. So it's the same thing. We provide inputs and so forth, but there's nothing else to do. That's it. The form works as a form, just the way it was intended. And so you can get your errors, you can disable the entire form, you can do everything with it. And we're going to take a look at that. Okay, let's go to Chrome. Okay. All right, so that means if I remove name, which, there it is, hold on. So if I remove name, it's going to say it's invalid, so I put in a name. If I select more than one option, it's going to say this is valid. So I can now submit it, and of course, when I look at my value that comes out, it's everything that I want. So even in that custom component, I was able to design what the data payload would look like when the person would finally select it. So that goes back to the control, and the control puts it into your data model, right? So you can construct a data model any which way you want. All right, let's go back. So we saw that if we create a custom component, we know that we have to implement inputs, outputs, event emitters, probably observables. Then it requires us to create these custom disable, enable, validations, errors, setters, implementation for pristine, if the person has touched the form, right? Those are all things that are free inside the control. So this is a lot of work and bugs. And then of course it gets more complicated, the more larger the form becomes, the more components you introduce into it, right? And sharing data is a nightmare, right? You have data flying all over the place. Unsustainable. Now, if we create a custom value accessor like we did in the previous example, we see there are no inputs, no outputs. Basically, it's reactive, right? It has disable for free, enable for free, validation, error handling, no setters, pristine, touch, dirty, reset, valid, patch, value, patch, set value, all those things that you need for initialization. This is no work. This is Angular's business, right? We have to not handle it. And then of course this simplifies when we have multiple components sharing each other. Why are we handling the data sharing? Let Angular deal with the data sharing with the value accessors, right? No work means happy life, right? For sure. And that's it. These are the steps that you can use to create custom value accessors in your parent components, just like any other form control. It's not complicated. And it allows you to interact with the parent's component's data model, right? You can exchange that data instantly, right, when value changes. And then of course, you can make those updates and persist or do anything you want with that data model, right? So as we discussed, the concept of value accessors in Angular and how they can be beneficial to us as developers. And it also demonstrated how we can create these custom value accessors and provide these real world examples that we have to contend with on a daily basis in Angular applications. So by utilizing the power of value accessors, developers can create more efficient, flexible, and maintainable applications, right? It's kind of like that blue box. Value accessors, they're bigger on the inside than the outside, right? Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, no questions? Yeah.
Sure. If you're trying to optimize for change detection and you're trying to use on components and stuff like that, are there any pitfalls or tips that anything that might be different there?
For forms in general, you mean?
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
if you're using
yeah, like for push detection, you can, the nice thing is when you do decide which detection you want to change, so if you want to do all on push, then remember the Angular components themselves or the form controls automatically listen to those changes, right? And they'll determine how they're going to, how to act that way. You don't have to think about your other components trying to figure out how they're going to act that way, right? And break the whole application. Because sometimes you do have some that you want to push and some that you need to keep active. And the form controls kind of handle that all by themselves. You almost don't even have to think about worrying about, oh, do I push? Do I do this? They're form controls. They know how to handle it best, right? And whenever you see those form controls change, they change each other, right? They're pretty flexible with it, and you can create, and that's the thing a lot of people don't understand, but you can basically create an entire app, just all form controls. And they all are reactive, and there's nothing for you to do, right? And you just drop it in, patch your data, there it is, right? Change the data, data comes back, save it on the server, right? So there's nothing really that you need to do oftentimes with components, right? You just stitch these, and what's nice is you rip them apart and you can plug them into any other application or any other form that you want to use, right? And they work the same way, right? Like there's no need for a developer to learn anything about a component that's a value accessor. All they need to know is, yeah, this is a control. This is what I know about controls, and as long as I have that, I'm good to go, right? Yeah. Thank you.